The Music Room is a special presentation of the Fresno Free College Foundation. Piano courtesy of Stevenson Music Centers. Our host for the Music Room is Philip Lorenz.
Good evening, this is Philip Lorenz welcoming you to the Music Room. My guest tonight is Steven Schick, a remarkable percussionist presently on the faculty of California State University, Fresno. His credits include several prizes in major competitions in Europe, plus extensive concertizing in Europe and the United States. He is one of the foremost champions of contemporary music, having premiered and recorded works by leading composers. In the near future, Mr. Schick will be presenting concerts of American music in New Zealand and Australia. It is my pleasure now to introduce Steven Schick.
Hello, I'm a percussionist. That means that I play all the instruments that you see in front of you here, and what I realized very soon in my career is that not many people realize what a percussionist does. Not many people know percussion instruments very well. So over the course of the next half an hour, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to some of these instruments which you see here, and then play a piece using all of them arranged around me in somewhat of a circle. A lot of people have misconceptions about percussion instruments. When they think of percussion, they think immediately of a marching band, for example, or a jazz band. I have a snare drum here, and I'd like to give you a little sample of what most people think of when they think of the word percussion. It sounds like this. Played on a very old snare drum in a marching style, and probably everybody has heard percussion in that context as a part of a parade, a marching band of some sort. But in fact, percussion is a great deal more than that. If this were all that percussion were, it would be very easy to transport. I would simply take the snare drum under my arm and away I would go. But it uses many, many, many more instruments than just that, and in very interesting ways. I'd like to introduce some of these instruments to you right now. Percussion instruments come from really all over the world. What you just heard was a snare drum coming from the European concert tradition. One finds snare drums back as far as the Renaissance, used in both marching situations and in concert situations. But percussion is really very international. For example, we have instruments like the gongs and the tam-tams. They come from the Orient. Here's a tam-tam. And from Canton, China, this gong. These metal instruments are handmade, and the sounds are generally very warm. They're played with big mallets covered with yarn. Also from overseas are such instruments as cowbells. These are German cowbells, and they're identical to the instruments that you find around the necks of cows if you go to the Black Forest or Bavaria. Ordinarily, a cowbell will have a clapper inside that rings back and forth and makes the instrument sound. These have been removed, and I play them again with yarn-covered beaters. From Africa, we get instruments called log drums. These are modeled on log drums. In Africa, they would actually be made out of hollow logs with slits cut in the top so that you can get two different tones. And a kind of a binomial Morse code could be used actually for communication in Africa. Now, with very large logs, as would be used in Africa, these instruments could be heard up to 7 miles in distance. From Latin America comes an instrument that's called a güiro. That's spelled with a G, G-U-I-R-O. It's an instrument that one scrapes, and all it is a gourd which has been hollowed out, and then there are grooves cut in the top. You scrape it with a stick or a mallet. Again, from Latin America. Another instrument from Latin America is the marimba. Now, the marimba looks a great deal like the piano. It's got white keys and black keys, and in fact it is really quite a simple matter for a pianist who has some skill with playing with mallets to pick up the marimba. It's a very easy instrument if you have that kind of facility. Now, this instrument differs from other percussion instruments largely in that it can play actual melodies. Most people think of percussion as being a noise instrument only, but in fact the marimba is quite capable of playing very, very beautiful melodies. It's an instrument which is found all over the world, really, primarily in Central and Latin America, but it can be found in some form in Africa and in Asian countries as well. Its counterpart, made in the United States, is an instrument called the vibraphone. This instrument was invented in the 1920s, primarily for use as a jazz instrument, and it differs from the marimba in a couple of important points. First of all, it's made out of metal, out of aluminum in this particular case, and so the bars ring. They actually have quite a long duration. That duration is controlled by the activation of a foot pedal, which allows the player to control the length of a given note. And so not only can I play melodies on the vibraphone, but I can play notes which will sustain. So the combination of the vibraphone on one hand and the marimba on the other gives the world of percussion an expressive range which is very comparable to that of the piano. Here are some percussion instruments which I'm sure are more familiar to most people. The drum family. That's when people think of percussion, they immediately think of the drums, whether in a marching situation, as I demonstrated earlier, or whether as a jazz instrument or a rock and roll instrument. Drums are generally played with wooden sticks, and the snare drum sounds something like that. But we also have a wide range of drums, from tom-toms to bongos on the top. Now, in many cases, bongo drums and their lower counterparts, the congas, are not played with sticks, but rather with the hands. One can get very sharp sounds depending on what part of the finger actually strikes the drum. A lower sound uses the entire finger, and a somewhat higher sound uses the very tip. Those are played with the fingers. What I would like to demonstrate right now is a very simple instrument which many people know. It's a tambourine, and ordinarily one wouldn't think that there would be much to demonstrate on a tambourine, but in fact, like the rest of the percussion family, it's a rather sophisticated instrument, and by changing the way in which one plays it, one can get an awful lot of different kinds of sounds. Ordinarily, you see the instrument played like this. Tilted at an angle so that the jingles will be held down. And this would be an orchestral way to play the instrument if you see an orchestra symphony percussionist. There are some variations, however. One can do a kind of a heel-toe version that gets two different sounds out of the tambourine. There are ways to shake the tambourine. If you watch MTV, you see rock stars playing the tambourine on their leg. That's actually how you know if it's a genuine rock star, because they all have bruises on their left leg. And then, in addition to that, one can actually play the tambourine by rubbing the thumb, creating friction between the thumb and the head of the tambourine. That's one major point I'd like to make about the world of percussion, that a simple instrument like the tambourine can be played in many different kinds of ways, each of which produces a radically different kind of sound. And so that is true also not just for the tambourine, but for the cymbals, the drums, the marimba, the log drums, all of the instruments that you see before you. And what you're seeing right now is really less than 1% of what actually exists in the world. There is a huge number of percussion instruments in the world. If you multiply that huge number times several different techniques for each instrument, that means that there are literally thousands and thousands of different kinds of sounds that the world of percussion can produce. This is actually what attracted me to it in the first place. As a kid, I played the piano and also some other single instruments, but I would occasionally get tired of the one sound that I could get out of other instruments. And when I started playing the drums, first of all, and then later all these other things, I was attracted to the variety of sound, to the ability to produce thousands and thousands of different kinds of sounds. One way in which a percussionist can produce many different kinds of sounds is by using different sticks or mallets. I have perhaps 10 or 15 different hardnesses of sticks or mallets, each of which corresponds to a specific instrument. Let me give you a brief demonstration. I have in my hand 4 different kinds of sticks, and if I play one instrument with the different mallets, you'll hear radically different sounds. First of all, just a regular cymbal, which I'll play in the first place with a very soft yarn mallet. That produces a typical cymbal sound, something I'm sure you've heard often enough before. If I change mallets and play it now with a somewhat harder mallet, that means that the core underneath here is harder, and I'm wrapping it with a thinner yarn. The sound is really substantially different. Again, a harder mallet, an unwrapped mallet. That produces yet a different sound, and finally a metal beater. So again, a single instrument with different mallets and striking it in different areas will produce lots of different kinds of sounds. You might wonder, what were all of these instruments used for in the first place? Well, initially, in the 20th century, percussion was used as a kind of a sound effects instrument. I mean, it would be in orchestra pits, in theaters, as a part of radio shows, in early television. For example, if you wanted to do an imitation of horses' hooves, all you had to do was ask the drummer. If there needed to be a typewriter sound or a boat whistle, the percussionist would often be asked to play those kinds of things. One of the things that attracts me about percussion is the fact that it's the oldest instrument that we have, and at the same time really the newest instrument. It's the oldest instrument because it was used by primitive peoples in very, very early kinds of music making. The drum is practically the first kind of instrument used. It came about really in a very simple manner. At least one speculation is that when hunters killed animals, they took their skins and in order to dry them would peg them out over a hole in the ground that allowed air to flow both underneath and on top of the instrument. And the hunter would then test to see how dry the skin was by tapping it. As the skin dried out, it would get tighter, and when it reached a certain pitch, then it was ready. It was a very simple step, really, to take that kind of skin over a hole in the ground and put it on some sort of pottery or vase and making the first kind of drum. To back up even farther, one of the very earliest percussion instruments was actually the human body, with a kind of a body-slapping ham-bone style technique that's really persisted all the way through to the present. And so very early music was made on percussion instruments, drums and rattles and scrapers and things like that that could be made from environmental materials, whatever happened to be present. But it is also an instrument of the 20th century. Composers, especially since the Second World War, have discovered, in quotes, percussion instruments. They've been there really all along, but composers have discovered what kinds of things were possible with percussion. Not just the wide variety of tones that are present in one instrument, but what composers could do, for example, if they assembled a large group of instruments. The piece that you see in front of you right now is written by a German composer by the name of Karlheinz Stockhausen, who lives in Cologne, Germany. And he experimented at the end of the 1950s, as many composers did, with the world of percussion. To give you just a very brief background, especially after the Second World War, many composers tired little by little of the traditional means of making music. They wanted to cut themselves off from tradition, especially German composers, because of the horrendous experience of the Second World War, wanted to cut lines with tradition, anything that smacked of older music and older musical ideals. And so many composers started experimenting with instruments that were not part and parcel of traditional music making. In other words, they eschewed things like the piano, the string orchestra, and started concentrating on homemade instruments or percussion instruments or unusual techniques on other instruments. And so it was quite natural that these composers would turn then to the world of percussion, which was largely an untapped and very sophisticated reservoir of instrumental musical sounds. And Stockhausen, for example, was not only interested in experimenting with one single instrument or single instruments at a time, as had been the case in orchestra music, but rather wanted to combine instruments together into a larger formation. This is what the world of percussion calls multiple percussion, the use of more than one percussion instrument at the same time. This creates a wide variety of problems which doesn't exist in other kinds of percussion playing or other kinds of music. For one, each piece has a different arrangement. This particular arrangement and group of instruments will fit Stockhausen's Zyklus, but will not fit any other piece. And so consequently, when the percussionist, in this case me, when I try to learn a new piece, then I have to learn actually a brand new instrument. The marimba in this case is on my right side. In another piece it may perhaps be on my left or may not be there at all. And so I have to learn a brand new instrument for every piece and learn the physical arrangements of all of that. What is the result and the benefit of all of this is a piece which will produce an enormous amount of different kinds of tone colors and also a kind of a visual spectacle at the same time. Music has oftentimes been something that has tried to stay away from the visual aspect of things. A symphony orchestra, for example, dresses all in black tuxedos so that the audience doesn't notice what they look like. They're trying to neutralize, in fact, what the visual element of the music is. The world of percussion, on the other hand, seeks to enhance the visual element. We're interested very keenly, actually, in what the instruments look like and the kinds of motions that are involved in playing. I think, actually, if you took the instruments that you see before you here and put them in an art museum with the various shapes, the circles, the triangles, the different kinds of drums, one could actually pass it off as a kind of a modern sculpture. So this is one of the issues that Stockhausen was very much interested in, how percussion music looked. And because he made an arrangement of a couple of dozen percussion instruments here, the percussionist has to move very quickly back and forth between the instruments, in and among them, creating a kind of a choreographic effect, a visual, dance-like image that goes along with the music. When I play concerts, oftentimes the reactions are, I found myself looking as much as I was listening. And I often say to those people, that's exactly the idea, because percussion music should be seen as well as heard. There are also many logistical matters that come into play when I'm performing a piece like this. Exactly where to put the instruments, where to put the mallets, how to change mallets, because every instrument requires a different kind of mallet. So you can see that percussion music is really quite a sophisticated art, much unlike the common perception of a drummer playing with two sticks and playing an instrument absolutely as loud as it will go. We have a wide range of not only different tone colors, but also of dynamics, in other words, levels of loudness. The tambourine, for example, can be played at very, very soft volumes, or when it's played very loud, can be almost ear-shattering. So in essence, what I like to think of the world of percussion is as an orchestra. Here we have one person playing an entire orchestra. There are sections of instruments, a section of drums instead of a section of violins, a section of wooden instruments instead of a section of winds, for example, a section of metal instruments, etc. So one person can play an orchestra of percussion instruments. This, by the way, was another very an enhancing aspect of percussion. Composers were quite interested in this because one person can play between 25 and 100 instruments almost at the same time. That saved a lot of money and time in rehearsing other people who might have to play. Ordinarily, if you had to have one person per instrument, it would be a very complicated affair. What I'd like to do right now is to demonstrate parts of this piece for you so that you'll have a little bit of an idea about what you're going to hear. First of all, playing some of the instruments through. The piece is called Zyklus, which in German means cycle or circle. And if you use your imagination, you can see a kind of a circular arrangement of the instruments. The marimba obviously is a straight instrument, so it's not a perfect circle, but I'm surrounded by instruments. This piece was experimental in the sense that there are freedoms given to the performer which haven't been given to performers in previous music. I can actually pick which part of the circle I start on. If I were to play from the music, you pick the page in which to begin, play through the piece, and then when you reach the point at which you started, then the piece is over. So I've chosen to start here at the beginning with the drums. I could have easily chosen to start with the vibraphone or the marimba, but over the course of the 8-minute piece, I gradually worked my way around the circle to my left. So there are many, many visual aspects to this piece as well. I start out with a section that sounds like this. So Stockhausen clearly is interested in incorporating a large number of instruments together. The percussionist is not asked to play simply one instrument, but asked to actually play many different instruments incorporated into one. You've heard only the first 30 seconds of the piece. What I'd like to do right now is to play the entirety of it. It's a piece of about 8.5 minutes, and as I mentioned earlier, it's called Zyklus, which means that I'll be taken in a circle from a point at 0 degrees at the circle, facing you in other words, and gradually over the course of the piece, will turn counterclockwise eventually ending up facing you, and that will be the end of the piece. For that, I need to remove my microphone, my mallets, and then I'll play.
We have just heard Steven Schick performing Karlheinz Stockhausen's Zyklus. This is Philip Lorenz wishing you a very pleasant good evening.